In the morning of July 5th, 1969, Nancy Slover began an unwanted relationship with a man she had never met, having only spoken to him once over the phone. The man was a killer whom Nancy wouldn't even recognize if she saw him. And within a few days of their disturbing conversation, that anonymous killer wouldn't just know her name, but also where she lived. But there was much, much more to the story of the Zodiac killer's phone call to Nancy Slover, including details that were kept secret for decades. And it's definitely a story worth telling in my murder basement. Nancy Slover was a local, born in Vallejo, California, attending high school in the nearby town of Benicia. As a teenager, Nancy and her friends would sometimes park at a secluded spot outside of town, a spot just off isolated Lake Herman Road that the locals called Gate 13. Nancy went on to become a dispatcher for the Vallejo Police Department. Gate 13 followed her. We know the Zodiac to be a serial killer with multiple sets of victims, but the very first person to know that such a killer was on the loose in the San Francisco Bay Area was not some big city detective. It was Nancy Slover, the first in the world to know what is now common knowledge, and she knew because he told her. While that serial killer was still a month away from naming himself the Zodiac, the woman he spoke to early in the morning of July 5th, 1969, already had a personal connection with his first victims killed just before Christmas the previous year. In his call to Nancy, the Zodiac took credit for an attack he had just committed within the hour, the shooting of a young couple who were parked in a secluded area of Vallejo called Blue Rock Springs. But the caller also took credit for another shooting, the shooting that happened out on Lake Herman Road the previous year, just before Christmas, the unsolved murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, a young couple on their first official date, and who had made the deadly mistake of parking at Gate 13. And to Nancy's terror, within days of their phone call, the Zodiac killer would have Nancy Slover's home address. It's hard to imagine today, but back then it was common practice for newspapers to publish the home addresses of people mentioned in news articles. And Nancy was news. She was also a witness, having heard the voice of a murderer. Nancy worried she could be his next target, and instead of feeling safe in her own home, she felt trapped. From July 5th, 1969, until the day she died in 2012, Nancy never felt safe again. In June of 2006, after years of searching, I finally found Nancy Slover, and she was anxious to do what she could to help identify the Zodiac killer.
Hi, my name is Nancy Slover. I took the original call from the Zodiac, and I just got a hold of Tom, and there's a couple of things that I want to set the record straight about.
Nancy also provided insight into the world of police dispatching.
Dispatchers have always been predominantly female. There are several reasons for this, one of them being that women normally stay calmer during a crisis. They may fall apart afterwards. Don't know whether the Zodiac knew that at the time.
It was a no-brainer for me to play Nancy audio recordings of Zodiac suspects to get her reaction to their voices and see if she heard any similarities to her memory of the voice of the Zodiac killer. Here's what she had to say about Zodiac suspect Arthur Leigh Allen, who at that time was the top Zodiac suspect.
I've listened to Alan's voice print over and over again. He didn't sound familiar to my memory bank.
Here is Nancy giving her best imitation of Zodiac's message to her.
I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find the kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye.
We are at the 50th anniversary of the Zodiac mystery. 50 years since the Zodiac first killed out at Gate 13. And even after all this time, there is still much to be discovered about the Zodiac case. Nancy Slover is the perfect example. For decades, it was thought she was the only one to hear the Zodiac's voice during that call. It turns out the Zodiac killer did not dial the police directly. Nancy Slover was not the first woman the Zodiac spoke to over the phone early that morning. Nancy was the last. About 45 minutes after killing Darlene Ferrin and wounding Mike Mageau out at Blue Rock Springs, the Zodiac killer entered a payphone in Vallejo, picked up the receiver, and dialed 0 for the operator. According to official Vallejo Police Department reports, which were kept secret for decades, that call was answered by a Mrs. Johnson, an operator for Pacific Telephone and Telegraph, also called PT&T. Mrs. Johnson was located at a nearby telephone office, which were quite prevalent throughout the region. Eventually, Mrs. Johnson patched the Zodiac through to Nancy Slover in the Vallejo Police Department. By Nancy's account, her subsequent interaction with the Zodiac killer only lasted about 20 seconds or so, at which point the Zodiac hung up the phone receiver, ending the call and the connection. But by that point, PT&T had already successfully traced the location of the phone booth Zodiac had used, a phone booth located at Springs Road and Tuolumne Street in Vallejo. The tracing process was initiated by Betty Main, a supervisor who was located at the PT&T central office outside of Vallejo. Nancy Slover had nothing to do with the Zodiac's call being traced. The assumption has long been that either Nancy Slover or perhaps a second party overhearing the Zodiac's confession to Nancy had been responsible for the tracing process. But had that tracing process begun after Nancy, it never would have reached a successful conclusion, as the 20 seconds or so that Nancy interacted with the Zodiac was not nearly enough time back then to trace a call. Therefore, Betty Main at the PT&T central office must have already been notified by Mrs. Johnson of a call in need of being traced, and that notification had to have been received a significant amount of time prior to when the Zodiac was patched through to Nancy Slover. The implications are simply astounding. Not only are there 2 additional witnesses to the Zodiac's voice, Mrs. Johnson and Betty Main, but the likelihood appears high that upon initially reaching the operator, Mrs. Johnson, the Zodiac must have had a substantial enough and troubling enough conversation with her that Mrs. Johnson felt the need to covertly alert her supervisor, Betty Main, that a trace needed to be undertaken immediately. We can only speculate as to what the Zodiac could have said to Mrs. Johnson, and that's because Pacific Telephone and Telegraph, PT&T, had a policy called Secrecy of Communications. All employees had to sign an agreement not to divulge overheard information, or they would be terminated and sued. And that policy was 100% legal, even if it was a criminal matter. The request of the Vallejo Police Department to interview Betty Main was denied by Pacific Telephone and Telegraph. Mrs. Johnson and Betty Main were never interviewed by law enforcement, nor did they ever make any comments whatsoever about what they heard from the Zodiac killer early that morning, before Nancy Slover ever spoke to the man who killed Darlene at Blue Rock Springs, as well as David and Betty at Gate 13. Mrs. Johnson and Betty Main can no longer tell their stories, even if they wanted to. But my hope is that one day I'll be contacted by a close friend or relative of theirs who can talk and tell me exactly what the Zodiac killer said that morning so long ago. And if that day ever comes, you can bet it will be a story that I will tell in my murder basement.
The whole thing about a code, you got to remember also, once until a code is broken, you have never any way of knowing whether it's a real code or whether it's just a fake code.
Oh, what's that mean?
Oh, it just means that sometimes, like the military and all of that, sometimes you would send garbled messages that meant absolutely nothing, so that you get the enemy to spend all their time trying to break the code.
I listened to the voice of Richard. I felt shocked and deja vu. In my opinion, he was the same person who I listened to in July of 1969, or twin.